Okay, so we will be talking about our first impressions of using Argo CD for a couple of projects. And we'll be talking about what, why, and how to Argo CD, pretty much. So starting with what it is. According to the documentation, it's a declarative GitOps continuous delivery tool for Kubernetes. So it's a pull-style continuous delivery solution which reads Kubernetes manifests or customized overlays or Helm charts, for example, from Git, and then applies it to a Kubernetes cluster. And it runs as a service within the cluster. So you can see it as it's pulling manifests into the cluster and deploys it from within. And why? Well, it's declarative, so we can write this configuration as Kubernetes manifests as well, and keep in Git. And Argo CD can almost entirely be configured declaratively, but we need to give it a service account token. So there are some minor stuff. There are also different levels of sync and prune automation depending on your use case, which I think is nice. Since you can configure if you want your application to automatically apply new manifests as they appear in Git, or if you want someone to actually go in and press sync to deploy those manifests. And also pruning if you want Argo CD to remove Kubernetes resources that are no longer part of the Git repository, or if they should stay there for later cleanup. It's also possible to isolate Argo CD to specific namespaces, and you can configure resource inclusions and exclusions, which lets you really fine-tune what objects Argo CD should be managing and in which namespaces, which works well with the clusters where you want that kind of control. Compared to, it feels like most of these solutions want cluster admin access to the entire cluster and wants to almost have like an etcd copy in memory and work with that. But this way you can really restrict it to what it should actually be working with. It also has a nice web interface, and it performs authentication with DEX. So this way you can give people who shouldn't have cluster access to Argo CD, so they can still manage delivery of the application without actually having permissions to the cluster. This compared to, for example, Flux, where you don't have this, so you have to have some kind of access to the Flux pod to be able to trigger syncs or something like that. And it integrates well with OIDC since it's using DEX. It comes with, I think it's admin and read-only roles by default, but that's configurable as well, and it's a separate thing compared to the Kubernetes role-based access controls. It's also possible to configure KSOPs integration for encrypted secrets that Pavan has worked with. And you can enforce signature verification so that Argo CD will have a list of trusted GPG keys, which it will verify signed commits with, and only those commits where it can verify the signature will be able to be deployed to the cluster. Another nice thing is that it only requires read-only access, while as a Flux version 1 instance I was running with wants write access by default, since it wants to store some metadata in the repository. It is possible to run as read-only, but that's kind of the default behavior for Argo CD. Yeah. So why Argo CD over other solutions? And I guess I've been talking about this a bit, that we can configure RBAC in Argo. So we separate this access from cluster access, since it's not really the same thing. And another nice thing is that it's not intrusive to the application manifests, in the sense that you have your Helm chart or your customized manifests or your plain manifests, whatever, and that's just for the application. You don't have to involve Argo CD at that stage. So that's kind of agnostic to your application configuration. While compared to Flux version 1, for example, where you have to include some Flux configuration in that repository. And Flux also, I'm talking about Flux version 1 here again, it also mutates the manifests a bit before deploying it. So it's more difficult in, say, break class situations where you want to go in and manually do changes, since what you have in the repository isn't really mirrored in the cluster as close as you can get it with Argo CD. So how then? There is a CRD called application, where you specify which cluster and namespace to deploy to, and which repository you want to deploy. And then you also specify a revision, which can be a specific commit or a branch or just head, as in the example here. And this is also where you specify if you want to have pruning enabled or some kind of sync automation. And they also suggest using applications to manage other applications for further automation. So you can have an application manifest that manages a repository that has applications for your actual services. And this chart is an example of that, how that can look like. So you have this application called Argo CD Applications, which manages a Git repository that's called Argo CD Applications. And this Git repository contains its own application, so to speak, so it manages itself, but it also contains applications for the services that it should be deploying to the cluster. And here, for example, we have the Git repository service, where we have one branch for the dev environment and one branch for a QA environment. And they use customized overlays on different parts of the repository. And then there are applications with configuration for these environments for Argo CD to manage. Yeah, and we have a short demo for Pavan to show.